Death was rattling his door. But he wouldn't give in. His last will became a death sentence for his family. How did a sick boy king trigger a war for the throne? A shocking conspiracy, treachery, and all of England on the brink of disaster, and the illness began its slow, merciless work. Picture it. The once vibrant, if frail monarch now wasting away before their eyes day by day. The cough grew deeper, draining the last remnants of his strength, his breath a ragged gasp in the night, every fever spike, like another nail in the coffin of his youth, his life, his hopes. The weakness was so profound that merely lifting his head became a feat of endurance. His world shrank to the bedroom walls, to the faces of worried physicians whose remedies were useless, to the whispers of courtiers beyond the door. But within this weakening shell, his spirit seemed only to temper, hardening into steel, white-hot. The closer death crept, the fiercer his fanaticism became. Religion, that was all that consumed him, not solace, no, a new, burning obsession. Faith transformed into a fortress against the terror of oblivion, but also into a weapon against those who might dismantle the work of his life. He saw himself not just as a king, but as God's chosen, tasked with saving the true faith, Protestantism, from the dreadful Catholic blight. And the main threat to this holy cause had a name: Mary, his own half-sister. The thought that Mary, a staunch Catholic, would ascend the throne and with a single stroke undo all the reforms he had so painstakingly implemented, drove him mad. Every breath, every beat of his weakening heart fueled this fear. He didn't just fear for his soul. He feared for the souls of millions. He feared his legacy would be trampled into the dirt, that churches would once again be filled with idols, that a bloody crackdown on Protestants would begin. This wasn't fear of death. It was fear his life was meaningless. Fear of defeat in the grand cosmic battle of good versus evil as he saw it. And in this mix of physical agony, religious zeal, and paranoid terror, a desperate, insane plan was born. If law and tradition led to disaster, then law and tradition had to be broken. Around the fading monarch gathered those who shared his fears, or more likely skillfully exploited them, and they began to forge a conspiracy horrifying in its essence. A coup d'état planned on the king's very deathbed. The goal: to strip Mary of her legal right to the throne, to place a puppet who would ensure the preservation of the Protestant regime. Imagine those secret meetings, those nervous whispers in rooms thick with the smell of medicine and death, every word a step on the edge of an abyss, every signature on a document changing centuries of succession, a crime. What drove this dying youth? Sincere conviction, or was he manipulated? Probably both, but the result was the same. A desperate measure, born of fear and fanaticism, was poised to plunge the country into chaos. Everything was at stake: peace, religion, the future of the nation. The king's final illness had become a ticking bomb under the foundations of the state, and the clock was counting down relentlessly. The flickering candlelight cast ghastly shadows on his pale, wasted face. Every breath was an incredible struggle, reducing the mighty king to a pathetic, gasping figure chained to his bed. This wasn't just sickness. It was slow, agonizing torture. A public dance of death witnessed by all who dared to approach close enough. The pain wasn't just physical. The pain was in his eyes. The eyes of a man who saw his life, his power, his carefully constructed plans slipping through his fingers like sand. Picture the scene. The silence of lavish rooms broken only by a ragged cough, and the low, anxious whispers of courtiers who already sensed the approaching end, and were frantically figuring out whose side to back. He clung to life, but even more fiercely, he clung to control, to thoughts of what would happen after. Only recently he had been at the top of the world, commanding destinies, confident in his righteousness, in his future. But death doesn't care about the plans of kings. It came, unstoppable and indifferent, to bring down the house of cards he had built on his ambitions. With his last exhale, with that final, terrible gasp that never turned into another inhale, not just silence hung in the air, but a sense of disaster. All his schemes, all his instructions, all his calculations regarding his successor, the future of the country, the future of the Reformation, all of it instantly turned to dust. This wasn't just the end of a life. It was the collapse of an entire era, the crash of a dream built on shifting sand. And then, like an inevitable, shocking blow of fate, Mary took the throne. The very Mary whose right to the throne he had tried to bypass, whose beliefs were diametrically opposed to his own. Her ascent wasn't just a change of monarch. It was the absolute, triumphant revenge of the forces he had so desperately sought to suppress. It was a slap in the face to everything he had fought for. How quickly everything changed. Only yesterday his will was law, and today power had passed to the person he considered his main opponent. What would he have felt had he known? Rage, despair, or the bitter realization of his own failure? It was at this very moment, when his body hadn't even cooled and his plans were already trampled, that the merciless re-evaluation of his reign began. Historians, politicians, the common people, all looked at the deceased king from a new angle. The aura of infallibility vanished, the fog of absolute power dispersed, and a completely different picture emerged. He was no longer a young, promising ruler. He had become a figure who, it seemed, was literally corrupted by the immense power that had fallen into his hands. Power, absolute and boundless, had poisoned him, made him ruthless towards opponents, blind to consequences. Questions arose: was he a despot? Did he use his religious zeal as a cover to strengthen his personal power? His place in history turned out to be not what he had perhaps envisioned for himself. Not a hero of the Reformation, but perhaps a tyrant whose ambitions and cruelty led to chaos and reaction. His reign, which had seemed unquestionable during his life, became the subject of fierce disputes and harsh judgments. For ultimately, history judges not by intentions, but by results, and the results of his reign after his death looked, to put it mildly, disastrous for his cause. It is a lesson in how quickly greatness crumbles, how merciless posthumous judgment can be, and how dangerous it is to be drunk on power, even if you are God's anointed. Holding its breath, England waited. Years passed, the crown yearned for a male heir, and Henry VIII changed wives, sending one to a convent, another to the scaffold, in a desperate hunt for a son. And then, in October 1537, within the walls of Hampton Court, a cry finally echoed that changed everything. It was him, the long-awaited one, the savior of the dynasty, Prince Edward. The joy was deafening. Bells rang throughout the country, cannons boomed, wine flowed like water. The king, at last, held in his arms not just a baby, but the embodiment of all his hopes, the guarantee of the future, proof of heaven's favor after so many years of turmoil and loss. He was a triumph, he was a miracle. But fate is a cruel mocker. The woman who gave this miracle to the world, Queen Jane Seymour, paid the ultimate price. Just 12 days of triumph gave way to grim silence. Fever, exhaustion after childbirth, the young queen faded away. Her death was a shock, a terrible soul-chilling blow. Imagine the contrast. Only yesterday, cries of "Long live the king and prince." Today, funeral bells and whispers of grief. The child who brought such joy also became the cause of such irreplaceable loss. And there he was, this tiny prince, surrounded by care and reverence, but deprived of the most important thing, the warmth of a mother's hands, a gentle lullaby, a simple, unconditional maternal gaze. His life began under the banner of triumph, but was immediately shadowed by tragedy. From his first breath he wasn't just a child. He was a treasure, a priceless artifact upon which everything depended. His status as heir demanded unthinkable caution. He was swaddled, not with a mother's tenderness, but with ceremonial precision. His room was guarded, his diet controlled, his health became a matter of state importance. Every sneeze, every cough sent the court into a panic, and this constant, obsessive care, intended to protect him from the minutest threat, had its monstrous downside. Isolation. Edward was kept away from the dangers of the world, but also from its normal life. He grew up behind walls, surrounded by nannies, governesses, and later strict tutors, but no peers. He lacked spontaneity, simple human warmth, carefree interaction. His childhood was a meticulously planned project, devoid of the emotional intimacy that shapes a personality. He was taught languages, theology, warfare, everything a future king must know. He was intelligent, diligent, and made an impression. But how lonely he must have been in that golden cage. He was surrounded by loyal servants, but who among them could just hug him? Who could comfort him in a moment of childish hurt or fear, as a mother would have done? He saw the king, his powerful father, rarely, only during formal visits filled with protocol, not fatherly love. The extent of his loneliness is hard to overstate. Born for greatness, he found himself in an emotional desert from infancy. His fate was sealed, to be king. But at what cost? At the cost of his very childhood and that priceless bond with his mother of which he was so early deprived. He was the most important child in England, but perhaps one of the loneliest. Imagine the cold, high walls, the oppressive vaults of the studies where childish laughter and games were forbidden. Here, in this golden cage, not just an heir was being formed, but an instrument in the hands of fanatics, whose faith was sharp as a blade, and whose convictions were as unshakable as mountain ranges. His childhood wasn't a carefree tapestry of discovery, but an intense, relentless plunge into a world of theology and politics, where every word, every gesture was steeped in a single, all-consuming idea: absolute supremacy. His tutors were radical Protestant theologians. Not mere scholars, mind you, but men utterly consumed by a mission. They saw the young prince not as a child, but as a vessel to be filled with truth, their truth, and they went about it with a fervor that bordered on cruelty, hour after hour, day after day. Postulates that brooked no doubt were hammered into his head. History lessons became tales of heroic Protestant martyrs and scheming, depraved Catholics, agents of the devil himself. Latin and Greek weren't just for reading the classics, but so he could pore over the Holy Scriptures himself and find confirmation for every dogma being pounded into him. The cardinal lesson etched into that young mind sounded like a decree: the divine right of kings. This wasn't just some dry political theory. This was a sacred, undeniable truth, carved into his very soul. His authority didn't spring from the people, not from tradition, but directly from God. This made him a sacred figure, answerable only to the heavens. Any disagreement, any criticism, any resistance to his will, that wasn't mere treason, it was sacrilege, an outright rebellion against the Creator himself. What did a child feel when such a monstrous burden of responsibility and such absolute grandeur were being crammed down his throat? Fear, pride, the chilling loneliness of that unreachable height, and alongside this, a burning, fervent gospel of Protestant supremacy. Only their faith was pure, correct, saving. All others were heretics, damned souls, their teachings poisonous lies. Catholicism was painted as a citadel of evil, a hotbed of superstition and tyranny. He was taught to see every Catholic as a potential enemy, a threat not just to his crown, but to his very soul, and the soul of the nation. This ideology didn't just inform him, it indoctrinated him, shaping his worldview into a stark black and white canvas where his side was shining light and the other impenetrable darkness. The result, a staggering, sometimes frightening intellectual maturity. He could quote scripture verbatim, debate the finer points of doctrine, understand European politics better than many seasoned ministers. His mind was sharp as a tack, honed by constant drills and endless debates with tutors who tolerated no levity or laziness. He became a machine for absorbing knowledge. But at what price? The price was his soul. This was an upbringing devoid of warmth, of empathy, of understanding. The emotional isolation was absolute. Playing with peers, forbidden. Tender words and hugs, unheard of. His world was made of books, stern faces of tutors, and the cold walls of the palace. He learned to rule over abstractions, over peoples on maps, over theological disputes, but never learned to understand human hearts, neither his own nor anyone else's. He was being raised as a future head of state, but not as a human being. This cold, methodical indoctrination didn't just give him knowledge. It burned deep, indelible convictions into his soul. Convictions in his own righteousness, his divine election, and the sacred duty to annihilate the enemies of the true faith. This wasn't just a syllabus, it was the making of a tyrant, draped in the mantle of piety. What awaited a country to be led by a ruler with a brilliant but emotionally crippled mind, fanatically convinced of his absolute right and the infallibility of his faith? The stakes were unimaginably high, and this education laid a ticking time bomb under the future of an entire people. The death of Henry VIII hit England like an ice-cold shower. The unbroken lion who had ruled with an iron fist was gone, leaving behind not just a widow and daughters, but a boy. 9-year-old Edward, fragile, perhaps sickly, was proclaimed king. Picture the scene. A majestic throne room steeped in mourning, and on the throne that a giant had occupied just days before, sits a child. His feet likely didn't even touch the floor. What weight settled on those young shoulders? Fear, bewilderment, or perhaps in those young eyes a spark of power inherited from his father already flickered. The kingdom held its breath. Who was really in charge now? A regency council made up of powerful, ambitious men ready to tear the country apart for their own gain, led by the king's uncle Edward Seymour. The future Duke of Somerset, This council seemed destined to be the true seat of power, and the boy on the throne merely a formality, an obedient puppet in their skilled hands. But they were wrong, terribly, utterly wrong, and all this was happening in an England torn apart by religious war. Not open conflict, but simmering just beneath the surface, Catholics loyal to the old faith and Protestants, hungry for reform and purification of the Church, eyed each other with hatred and fear. Every word, every gesture of the new government, every appointment, everything was scrutinized under the microscope of this enmity. Put yourself in the shoes of an ordinary person of that era. Whose side would win? Would you be burned at the stake for your beliefs? The air was thick with paranoia and a sense of impending doom. A child king, a council riddled with infighting, and a country teetering on the brink. The stakes were sky high, but then the unthinkable happened. While the councillors argued and schemed, the little king began to show character. They say he was astonishingly intelligent and pious. Protestant pious, that is. Historians still debate how much was him acting alone, and how much was manipulation by his tutors and Protestant courtiers. But the facts are stubborn. Under his name, with his signature, decisions were made that dramatically yanked England towards the Reformation. He didn't just rubber stamp papers. He reportedly asked questions, demanded explanations, displayed a chillingly acute awareness for his age. Imagine the shock of old, hardened politicians when a 9-year-old boy not only agrees but perhaps initiates or staunchly supports measures that fly in the face of their cautious plans. This wasn't just a child playing at being king. This was a force just awakening, but one that already held absolute power on paper. He didn't shout, didn't stamp his feet. Perhaps his power manifested in quiet, unwavering agreement with some, and icy silence for others. A child's power, backed by divine right and the names of powerful allies at court. His rapid assertion of a personal, though guided will was a bolt from the blue for many. He wasn't an empty shell. He was the son of Henry VIII, inheriting, it seems, not just the throne, but a sliver of his father's ruthless will and absolute conviction in his own righteousness. At a time when everyone expected chaos and weakness, it was precisely from the most unexpected source, the child's bedroom, that a hard, uncompromising line began to emerge. A line that would forever change England and show the world. Even a boy king could be a formidable monarch. And this was only the beginning of his incredibly short yet so significant reign. Long before Edward's name became synonymous with terror, the seed of darkness was germinating within him. It didn't arrive suddenly. The first sprouts of fanaticism and cruelty broke through even in his tender years, in games that were far from innocent. Picture the scene. The little prince, surrounded by toys and servants, but his gaze isn't fixed on sparkling baubles but on tales of torture, on engravings depicting the torments of sinners. This wasn't just childish curiosity about scary stories. This was a sick, twisted craving for the suffering of others, for the spectacle of pain. He demanded more and more details, his eyes burning with a strange, unsettling fire when the conversation turned to executions. His nannies and tutors, accustomed to the whims of a royal child, might have initially sighed and put it down to a rich imagination. But it wasn't imagination. It was a dark, growing obsession that found an outlet in the most unexpected, shocking forms. Soon, this craving began to mingle with piety, or what he himself perceived as piety. Religious rituals, elaborate masses, sermons about God's wrath. All of this landed on fertile ground in his already damaged psyche, and this is where the true horror began. The religious hysterics, not just the tantrums of a spoiled boy. No, these were fits of wild, uncontrollable rage, masked by supposedly divine inspiration. He would fall to the floor, writhing, screaming curses, accusing those around him of godlessness, demanding immediate retribution. Courtiers, frozen in horror, didn't know how to react. Was it a seizure or a calculated performance to get what he wanted? More often than not, he got his way. After all, who would dare cross someone who seemed to be speaking in the name of the Lord himself? Herein lay the terrifying, deadly danger. The combination of a child's sudden, unpredictable caprice with unlimited absolute royal power. A normal child might throw a toy or stamp their foot, but little Edward, sensing his chosenness and power, could throw a man onto the block. his sudden desire, a momentary whim, an instant slight, or a fleeting thought about sin in another's eyes, all could become the cause of the most monstrous sentence. He could order a man tortured simply because he seemed not pious enough in that specific moment. This wasn't just cruelty. This was chaos draped in the mantle of righteousness. And over time, this mixture only grew more dangerous. The childish caprice didn't disappear, but it took on new, more sophisticated forms. It became laced with calculation. Cruelty was no longer just a burst of anger or a fit of hysterics. It became a tool. He learned to use fear, torture, and executions not only to satisfy his morbid desires, but to consolidate his power, to crush any hint of resistance. The craving for the spectacle of suffering was transforming into a politician's cold-blooded ruthlessness. The journey from a boy utterly spellbound by gruesome tales of torture to a ruler who himself reveled in sending people to suffer was a chillingly rapid one. And every time his whims were indulged, every cruel demand met only fed that darkness, turning him from a troubled child into a purple-robed monster. The stakes were terrifyingly high. Lives, fates, the future of an entire people were on the line, and nobody, it seemed, was willing or able to stop this horrifying rise of evil. Picture a world where words carried the weight of lead, and thoughts were a crime. At the heart of this sinister theater stood Edward. This wasn't just some pencil-pushing administrator, not merely an enforcer. He was the architect of fear, the personal curator of a system of persecution that choked the life out of any dissent. How was this possible? How could one man build such a monstrous machine? He started at the very heart of things, with the sermons. These weren't words of comfort or spiritual guidance. These were fiery harangues, burning away doubt, instilling terror at the slightest deviation from prescribed dogma. Sitting in his study by candlelight, he penned lines that the very next day were broadcast across the squares, creeping into every home, every soul. Every word was honed like a razor blade, meant to cleave the loyal from the stray. He spoke of vigilance, of the duty to inform, of the sanctity of obedience and the foulness of heresy. This wasn't just text, it was an incantation, shattering the trust between people, forcing everyone to suspect their neighbor, their friend, even their own family. And that's how the thought police were born. Not with weighty decrees, but with whispers in ears, with suspicious glances. Edward didn't just allow snitching, he elevated informing to a civic virtue, then hammered it home as a grim duty. Picture the scene, people broken by fear or hungry for advantage, rushing to report a carelessly dropped phrase, a questionable book, a look on a face that seemed less than loyal. The system of informing, personally crafted and nurtured by Edward, became the very lifeblood of repression. It permeated society, poisoning it from within. Everyone knew a careless word could cost them their freedom, or even their life. But the most chilling part was that Edward didn't just oversee this from a distance. He personally curated the process. Folders of accusations compiled from these vile denunciations landed on his desk. He didn't delegate. He himself, with his own eyes, read every single accusation. He personally decided the fate of those the system had snared in its nets. And terrifyingly, he didn't just review the cases. He cranked up the severity of the punishments. Where a reprimand was called for, he ordered prison. Where prison was the sentence, he escalated it to the inquisitorial tribunal. What was this? Fanaticism, a lust for power, sadism, or a genuine belief he was rooting out evil? We can only guess what truly lurked in his soul when he signed a sentence that would shatter a person's life. This wasn't just a tale of bureaucracy or religious conflict. This is the story of how one man, armed with power and conviction, managed to build an apparatus of total control and fear. How words became shackles, and suspicion the norm. The system Edward created became living proof of how easily trust can be demolished, and how fast a society can plummet into the abyss when paranoia and unchecked power over minds take the reins. This was his personal crusade against freedom of thought, and he waged it with terrifying efficiency. The stakes weren't just high. The very human soul was on the line. Within the cold gleam of the royal palace, amidst the silks and gold meant to symbolize grandeur, a drama unfolded, far darker than any stage play. This was a story about family, or rather, its monstrous absence. At its heart was the young King Edward, thrust onto the throne by fate far too soon, and his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth, standing precariously on the path of his ascent to absolute power, For most people, family is a harbor, a refuge, a place of unconditional love and support. But for Edward, it seems, those words rang hollow. His relationships with his sisters were steeped in politics not bound by blood. Picture the scene: a young monarch surrounded by advisers whose whispers sounded louder than any family voice. He looked upon his sisters. One, Mary, the elder, a fervent Catholic, a symbol of the old world and a threat to the new order. The other, Elizabeth, the younger, cunning, elusive, whose adaptability made her both less overtly dangerous and more unpredictable. But there was no warmth towards them, no tender memories of childhood games, shared holidays, of that invisible, unbreakable tie that binds siblings. None of that in the eyes of Edward and those whispering in his ear. Mary was merely an obstacle, a living reminder of a past that needed erasing. She represented a formidable religious and political threat: her Catholicism, her claim to the throne under the old law, her potential backing from mighty Spain. Every prayer Mary uttered, every look she gave, every letter of her name was seen as a challenge, a spark capable of igniting rebellion. And this was where a truly chilling calculation showed its hand, a terrifying ruthlessness that even a seasoned politician seemed to lack, let alone a young man. The absence of natural affection meant the absence of any moral barriers. If there was no love, no compassion, what could stop you from eliminating a problem? What was on the line? No less than the future of an entire kingdom, the direction of its faith, its alliances. And for that prize, Edward, or those manipulating him, were ready to spill blood. The plans against Mary weren't just cold, they were brutal. This wasn't merely about sidestepping her in the line of succession. It was about her total elimination as a contender. Disinheritance was just the first step. What next? Isolation, life imprisonment, or perhaps something far worse? These plans festered within the cold stone walls of the palace, where family portraits hung alongside maps of political intrigue. This was a battle not for family happiness, but for the survival of a regime, a battle where a sister became the deadliest enemy. What did Edward feel, signing documents that doomed Mary to an uncertain future? Fear, triumph, or just an emptiness, a complete lack of emotion towards the person to whom he was bound by blood? This wasn't just a dispute over inheritance. It was a step into the abyss, showing how power can pervert the most fundamental human connections. This shocking disregard for family ties in favor of ruthless political calculation. That's what made this chapter of history truly dramatic and terrifying. A sister as a target, blood as a hindrance. What could be more horrifying? This is the story of a king who perhaps never truly knew what family was at all.